The Secret of the Nagas was published in August 2011. It's the second book of the Shiva trilogy, and it's a continuation of the Immortals of Meluha. You can't really understand Nagas without reading Meluha. It's actually one continuous story, which is just broken up into 3 books. The third book, The Oath of the Vayuputras, will be releasing soon. So, Secret of the Nagas was essentially a continuation of the story of Meluha, where Shiva's story was carried forward through the land of Swadeep and into the land of the Nagas, where many more mysteries, many mysteries were unveiled and new mysteries were created. And the philosophical concepts that I wanted to get across went a lot further in the Secret of the Nagas. All the descriptions that you see of the Indus Valley cities in the land of Meluha are all historically accurate. The flow of the Saraswati is historically accurate. The very term Meluha, the name Meluha, many Western historians have now believe that that was the original name of the Indus Valley civilization, because there have been texts discovered in Mesopotamia, which is ancient Iraq, which speak of a vast wealthy land of brown skinned people in the east called Meluha, which leads many historians to believe that this must have been the Indus Valley civilization. So, in the term Meluha is historically accurate. But to make the story a little more relatable, I have used modern names where possible. So, instead of using Jambu Dweep, for example, I have used India. Where possible, I have used modern names to make the story a little more relatable. A bit like, I mean, if you read many historical novels, there is either a perspective that you can keep it completely pure, which reduces the relatability, or you can make the names a little more modern. So, if you read Julian of Gore-Vidal, he does not use the name Mediolanum, he uses the name Milan, because whether you use Mediolanum or Milan, it's the same city. So, if you use a modern name, it just makes it more relatable. Well, the book began as a pure philosophical thesis around 8 years, probably 7 to 8 years ago, maybe 9 years, when we were watching TV and we discovered that something interesting, that for all of us Indians know that for us gods are called Devas and demons are called Asuras. What we discovered is that for the ancient Zoroastrian Persians, gods were called Ahuras and demons were called Daivas. So, their pantheon is the exact opposite of the Indian pantheon, which gave rise to an interesting discussion that if the Indians and the Persians had met in ancient times, we would probably be calling each other evil, because one person's god is another person's demon. So, who would be right? The obvious answer is neither, it is just a different point of view. It is not that either of the sides were evil, which gives rise to the next obvious question, that if neither of them are evil, then what is evil? So, a philosophy occurred to me as an answer to that question, and that was the genesis of the Shiva trilogy. So, the Shiva trilogy is essentially a series of adventure, thriller books to convey a philosophy of what is evil, because I believe that philosophy probably has relevance in today's world as well. Setting up the books in terms of research, I was lucky to be born into the kind of family I was born into. I was born into a very religious family. My grandfather was a teacher at Banaras Hindu University and a priest. Both my parents are very religious. So, like I always say, I learnt our philosophies and myths the way they are supposed to be learned, through listening, through Shruti. The ancients say that you were supposed to learn our philosophy through listening rather than reading, Shruti rather than memorizing, that Smriti. So, I guess I learnt it the old fashioned way. As far as the historical parts of the book are concerned, I have been a voracious reader all my life. I especially like reading pure history books. So, I guess most of the research, the historical research that have been used in the books were, I learnt it over the years of reading many history books. So, I guess all the knowledge was there somewhere in the back of my mind, but just having knowledge does not mean that it can emerge into a book. Some magic has to happen to bring it together, and I genuinely believe that for me that magic was Lord Shiva. He made it happen. How he made it happen, I do not know, but he made it happen. Look, I did try I am an MBA, so you know how we MBA types are. So, I did try and make a strategic plan to to write the book, because I had never written anything before. So, I made I read self-help books. I made a plan to write the book, with a date plan in Microsoft Excel and character sketches in Word, and the story flow in Microsoft PowerPoint. Like I always joke, very MBA, and that plan was a disaster. The book went nowhere. and it had actually come to a point where I was struggling with a particular character in the book, and I was trying to change his fate desperately, and no matter what I did seemed like a force fit. So the book had actually come to a halt, and my wife helped me out. She told me that you are trying to do a creative activity of writing books in your typical MBA style, and that's obviously not going to work. She said you have to give up the illusion that you are in control of the story. You are not, and she said that you have to accept the fact that your characters have a life of their own. They are living in a parallel universe, and you've just been given the privilege of entering that universe and recording what you see. So there's this line which she told me, and I love quoting that line everywhere. I think it's a wonderful line. She said, "Don't approach the book with the arrogance of a creator. Approach it with the humility of a witness." And I started doing that. I don't control the story at all. The way it comes, I just write it down. And once I started doing that, then I've never faced any writer's block or any such thing. I mean, the story just keeps flowing. I know it might sound strange, but I genuinely believe that Lord Shiva decides what comes in the story. I genuinely believe it's his blessing. I don't control the story at all. Whatever comes to me, I write it down. For me, every day that I live is in a way research. So I look forward to learning from different people whom I meet. And I read. I'm a voracious reader, so I read a lot. So anything that I read is knowledge which can be useful in books. And I tend to read more non-fiction, so non-fiction books, but scientific journals, economic journals. So I love reading anything, and all data, all knowledge that you learn sometimes can be useful in the book. So for example, the concept of anti-aging that I used, antioxidants, that concept I learned from an article I read in the Scientific American. So anything that you read can somehow, it's in a way research for the books. That's the way at least I see it. It emerged. It's not that I wrote a character sketch and I knew exactly what was going to happen, but as the story grew and grew further, yes, the entire story was clear in my mind. So before the release of the first book itself, before the release of The Immortals of Meluha, I had the entire story in my mind, right down to the last line of The Oath of the Vayuputras. But as I would start writing the book, there are various subplots that would develop. But the broad storyline, the concept was clear in my mind, right down to the last line of The Oath of the Vayuputras. Every person you meet influences your thought, and every person whose work you read influences your thought. The key lesson I think I've learned from my father is to keep an open mind. Don't judge people by the accent that they have. Don't judge people by the clothes that they wear. Listen to them, and there's something that you can learn from everyone. So every person that I meet is a learning experience for me. My entire family, I think, has closely influenced my book. In fact, I have to honestly say that they are so closely involved that many times I almost feel like it's a joint project, which just happens to have my name on it. So, in terms of the philosophical, spiritual discussions, I have a lot of that with my sister, with my mother, with my father. In terms of the story flow, I have a lot of discussions on that with my wife, with my brother, with both my brothers. With my sister-in-law. So I mean, everyone is very closely involved, and my family, they are a religious. It is a religious family. It's a very knowledge-obsessed group of people. I guess the culture that came from my grandfather on my father's side, and my grandmother on my mother's side. We are obsessed with degrees, knowledge, reading. It's just the culture that we have in our family. So it's a great atmosphere to live and breathe in, because I learn a lot from them, and they are very closely involved in my book. Firstly, if you read through our Purans, our Vedas, you will find that actually many of the myths are actually in contradiction with each other. One way of looking at it is in a lazy analysis would be that these myths and stories were all randomly written. But that's a very lazy analysis. I think the truth is perhaps the ancient Indians, like many of the ancients, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks, realized that time is actually a circular concept. In the ancient Indian way of life, I'm sure you're aware there are 4 yugs, 4 great periods of time: Satyug, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, and Kali Yuga. They actually work in circles, because after Kali Yuga it actually kind of goes back in waves and then goes back to a Satyug. So time kind of repeats in a cycle again and again. So something that may appear chronologically incorrect when you are looking at time as a straight line will not appear chronologically incorrect when you are seeing time as a circle. That the universe is essentially in a process of creation and destruction, and on the other side of destruction is creation once again. So, perhaps seeing chronological flaws in our myths and the myths of across of cultures across the world is perhaps a result of the way we approach time at this point of time. As far as what is a true myth is concerned, I believe in this theory. I mean, if you look to the root of the word mythology itself, the root of the word is a Greek word called mythos. What a dictionary meaning of it will tell you is mythos is a fanciful tale, a fantasy, which may have some grains of truth in it. I traveled to Greece a few years ago, and I met this wonderful Greek woman, and I'd asked her that according to the Greeks, what does mythos mean? And she told me that mythos means that which hides the truth. Okay, and that's a lovely meaning. Okay, and she says that the point of a myth is to make the journey towards truth a little interesting, because many times the truth is so simple that you don't appreciate it if you just get it too easily. If you understand that point, then you realize that actually all myths are just different paths to the same truth. So, what truly matters is the truth itself rather than the myth. And the ancients who realized this realized that actually you can have various different versions of the same myth, and it does not matter as long as you reach the truth at the end of it. The truth is, I believe, belief in the supreme force, belief in God, which can give you happiness. It's set in 1900 BC and would be a period of say 40 years from the beginning of the trilogy to the end, 40-50 years to the end of the trilogy.